Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Tonight we're going to be reading Esther. We will probably, maybe, get through the whole thing. We'll see how it goes. I want to make some comments about Esther before we start. Esther is in that group of books I've already talked about a couple times, before we talked about Tobit, before we talked about Judith, where these are a set of stories that were sort of handed down orally first, we talked about, and then got put into writing. And so we have sort of multiple versions once they get put into writing. Esther is going to be a really good example of this, because there's a Hebrew version of Esther which is actually written in Aramaic, and there's a Greek version of Esther. And everything that's in the Aramaic version of Esther is in the Greek version of Esther, but the Greek version of Esther has some extra stuff. Okay? So if you're using a Bible other than the Orthodox Study Bible, for most of tonight you will be okay, but every once in a while it'll seem like I'm just babbling and you won't see what I'm talking about. But you should be used to that if you've come to this Bible study before. So just go with it, ride it out like normal, and we'll get back to something recognizable in a second. I'll try to point out where those places are too. And if you do have the Orthodox Study Bible, this is one of the rare occasions where the Orthodox Study Bible even points it out. If you look at, like in chapter 1, the verse markings, it starts with verse 1a, then it has verse 1b, 1c, 1d, etc. And then on page 597, down at the bottom of the first column, all of a sudden you have verse 1, and then verse 2. Okay? That verse 1 and verse 2 on that column in the second page, that's where the Aramaic version starts. Okay? So that first part that's labeled 1a, b, c, d through 1m, that's part of the longer Greek version. So even in the Orthodox Study Bible, they kind of marked out where these differences are. And when we get to the end, the Greek version even tells us where the Greek version came from. The Greek version is Greek version that arrived at a particular time and was brought by a particular person who's listed to the library at Alexandria to be added to the Hebrew scriptures that they had on record there. Esther, of those three, as I mentioned, since Esther has an Aramaic/Hebrew version, Esther is the only one of those that's sort of uncontested. Of Tobit, Judith, and Esther. Tobit and Judith, as we noticed, having to hand out Bibles, are in what's called the Deuterocanonical books. Esther, at least a version of it, is in everybody's Bible. One of the interesting things about the Aramaic version of Esther, though, is that the Aramaic version of Esther contains absolutely no references to God whatsoever, making it somewhat unique in a book of the Bible, right? Whereas in the longer version, there are references, more direct references to God. Okay. We're going to see as we go through that what the reason for that is and how God is talked about when he's talked about in the longer version. So we're going to talk more about that a little later. But something to note about the book of Esther. Last thing to note is about names. If you took a look at this at all before we came in tonight in the Orthodox Study Bible, you probably noticed that the king, throughout the actual translation of the book of Esther in the Orthodox Study Bible, is referred to as Artaxerxes. Whereas in the introduction in the Orthodox Study Bible to the book, it says King Xerxes. Okay? This is because historically, in terms of the other names and places and events in the book, okay, the king in the book would be Xerxes, actually Xerxes the first, technically, the Persian emperor, okay, who his name in the Aramaic version, they weren't real good with this whole X thing. There's no X in the Aramaic alphabet. So in Aramaic, his name came out as Ahasuerus. Okay? So, for whatever reason, even though in the introduction to the book in the Orthodox Study Bible, they correctly identify him as King Xerxes, they then proceed to call him Artaxerxes throughout the translation, I guess just to confuse people. Or different, one person translated it and another person wrote the introduction. I don't know exactly what happened there. But the king here is the Persian Emperor Xerxes, who is the same Xerxes, if you saw the movie 300, same guy. Okay, this is the King Xerxes after Cyrus and Darius, first two Persian emperors. Xerxes is the one who pushed and expanded the Persian Empire beyond what it already was. It already controlled from India all the way over across the Middle East. Under Xerxes, they not only took control of big chunks of Egyptian territory, they also took over Asia Minor, which is what's now Turkey. And at that time, the western coast, the whole western coast of what's now Turkey, were all Greek city-states. Okay, the Greeks didn't have one government yet. They had all these separate cities. All of those cities were conquered by Xerxes, and then he set out, this is the period that's called the Persian Wars. This is when the Battle of Marathon happened, where the messenger ran all those miles and then dropped dead. And so he celebrated by running the same distance. Seems odd to me, but people do it. And the Battle of Thermopylae, which is what the movie 300 is about, those all took place in these Persian wars, which were launched by Xerxes across then the straits to attack what's now Greece, the Peloponnese, the other Greek city-states of Sparta and Athens and their dependents. Okay, so this is the same king. And he's going to be described here in Esther as controlling 27 provinces between India and Ethiopia. To give you an idea of how big his territory is. Okay, and if you want to read, if you're interested in learning more about that Persian and Greek history, there's a really good book by an author called Tom Holland called Persian Fire, where he not only talks about the Persian Wars with the Greeks, but he goes through the whole history of the Persian Empire up until this time. There's not a lot of reference to the Bible in it, unfortunately. But he goes through the whole history of the Persian Empire up to this time, and the whole history of the Greek city-states up to this time, and then talks about the Persian Wars. So if you're interested in that part of history, that book, Persian Fire, is a good book to read about it. This story that we're going to read, like the story of Tobit and Judith, much smaller story dealing with individual people. It's set in Susa, the city of Susa, S-U-S-A, which was the capital of the Persian Empire in what's now Iran. The two main characters, who are Esther and Mordecai, the two Jewish main characters of the book, there are actually two traditional tombs, technically, for them, where they're said to be buried. One is in Iran, and is basically in ruins, because the Iranian government hasn't kept it up. The other one is in Palestine, and which is, the one in Palestine is much better kept up and decorated. It is basically set up for tourists. In terms of which one is real, there's no reference whatsoever in the book of Esther to them going back to Palestine. In fact, the whole setting of the story is that these are two of the Jewish refugees who got into exile who didn't go back with the waves of returnees that we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah. This is taking place at about the same time as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but back in Persia. So since they're pretty much set up as Jews who stayed in Persia, it's probably far more likely that the Persian site, run down and ugly and unvisited as it is more likely to be the actual place where they're buried.
So they don't claim that they were moved or anything like that?
No. Now the other major tomb that's in Iran is the tomb of the prophet Daniel, and that actually is kept up and decorated because Islam accepts Daniel as a prophet, whereas Esther has been considered a prophet by the Jewish and Christian traditions, but not in Islamic tradition.
Well, she's a woman too.
Well, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right there. She's a lady.
That doesn't help. So, last note before we get started, I mentioned the two main Jewish characters are named Esther and Mordecai. Esther and Mordecai are not Jewish names. Okay? We saw how, and we're going to see more of this when we get into the book of Daniel and some of the other books. Under the Babylonians, we saw this happen with the kings and some of the other refugees, where they were given new names. Right? And we talked about how that was part of the way the Babylonians did business, to say, you're not Jews or whatever you were before we conquered you anymore. You're now Babylonians. So you're going to have a Babylonian name. Right? To shift their identity. It's the same kind of thing that happened in a really dark way with slavery in the United States. Slavery in the United States, before it was abolished, when Africans were brought here, they weren't allowed to use whatever their name had been in Africa. They were given some English Western name, all right, as a way to force a new identity onto a person. Okay, so in this case, Esther most likely comes from Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess. Ishtar. And Mordecai comes from Marduk, who was another Babylonian god, who was the son of Ishtar, and who was involved in the creation of humankind. So these are not their original names, Esther and Mordecai. These are the names that they were given by the Babylonians, and which are still their legal names under the Persians. Now, be that as it may, since then, these have actually become popular Jewish names, because of course Esther and Mordecai are the characters of the story of the Bible. So today you'll meet plenty of Jewish people named Esther or Mordecai, but originally they were not. They were not Hebrew names. Okay. So I'm going to start in, I guess, 1:1a. So for those of you, if you don't have an Orthodox study Bible, bear with me for a couple minutes here, and then we'll catch up to where you are. So in the second year of the reign of the great king Artaxerxes, or I'm just going to say Xerxes from now on the first day of Nisan, Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. He was a Jewish man living in the city of Susa, a great man who served in the court of the king. He was from the captives Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had deported from Jerusalem, with Jeconiah, the king of Judah. And this was his dream. Now, stopping there for a second. Remember, that's the second deportation. So the point here is Mordecai is an old man. Okay. We're now talking about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the people are returning. Okay, and he was one of the people who was originally deported. That means he's got to be at least, minimum in his 70s, possibly in his 80s. So he has this dream, 1D, and this was his dream. Behold, there was noise and tumult, thunder and earthquake, confusion on the earth. Two great dragons came forth, both ready for combat. A great roar came forth from them. And at the sound of them every nation prepared to wage war against the nation of the just. And indeed it was a day of gloom and darkness, tribulation and anguish, oppression and great confusion upon the earth. The entire upright nation was troubled, fearing the evils against them. They were prepared to perish, and they cried out to God. And at their cry there came forth, as it were from a small spring, a great river having abundant water. There was light, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted, and they devoured the esteemed. Mordecai, who had seen this vision and what God was planning to do, awoke. He kept it in his heart and wished to ponder it until night. So this dream, now keep in mind this is part that's only in the Greek version. A few notes on it. First, 1G. There's 1G there. Indeed, it was a day of gloom and of darkness, tribulation and anguish. Did that sound familiar to anybody?
Ish.
Well, it's quoted in a service we do. It's quoted in the funeral service. Woe to him who wishes to behold the terrible day of the Lord, for it is a day of gloom and darkness. Okay. Referring to this. So, this image, this is the first time we heard the phrase, the day of the Lord. We're going to hear, as we get into the prophets very soon, the beginning of next year, the phrase, the day of the Lord, we're going to hear over and over again. Okay. And that doesn't mean the Lord's day like Sunday. Sort of does, but not really. Not really. The day of the Lord is the day when the Lord is going to visit his people. And again, visit sounds nice. It sounds like, he's going to come over and have some coffee, we're going to talk, set out some pinafores, Right. That's not... When God visits, there's going to be a reckoning, right? Things are going to get set in order. Things are going to get set in order. Okay? So things are going to be straightened out that have gone awry. Okay, so for some people that's good news. For some people that's bad news. Okay? So this is a reference to that. Okay? This day. Now preceding that, we have this image of these two dragons coming forward. Okay? Part of this is a play on Mordecai's name. Mordecai got renamed after Marduk. Okay? In Babylonian mythology, the way the world came into being, there's a document called the Enuma Elish where you can read this. You're really fascinated by it. But there were two great oceans. There's the ocean above, the sky, and the ocean below, the water. And these oceans were also two dragons named Tiamat and Baphomet. Okay. Baphomet.
Is that how the world was created?
Well, and so Tiamat and Baphomet, to produce the world, made love to each other.
Oh.
These two dragons. Okay. So these two ancient dragons are sort of the beginning, the most revered figures in Babylonian mythology. What happens then is Marduk comes and kills Tiamat. After he kills her, her blood spills out on the ground, and her blood becomes human beings.
Now this is the guy who just slept with her who kills her?
No, this is a different guy. This is Marduk, who Mordecai is named after.
Ah.
Okay, it's the one who kills this one dragon. And that produces human beings. Okay, so this is the mythological background. So Mordecai sees these two dragons. Okay? Except these two dragons aren't here to create the world. Right? They're not gods. These two dragons are here to inspire all the nations of the world to come and kill the nation of the just, meaning the nation that follows God, meaning Israel. Okay? So he's sort of taken their Babylonian mythology and flipped it. Right? So this is the picture of evil. Two dragons are going to come. They're going to bring evil. They're going to come down to destroy God's people. And then that is going to be the day. That is going to be the day when God comes and visits his people. Because the people are going to cry out to God. Right? Then we have this image of a small spring that blossoms forth into this great river. Where does that sound familiar? Jesus says he who believes will have streams of water flowing forth from within them. Right? And then what's the result? The result of this water is the sun rises. Right? There's light, the sun rises. And the way it's phrased in the Greek, the lowly were exalted and they devoured the esteemed. Meaning the last become first and the first become last. Right? Which is something Jesus says again and again and again and again. He tags it on to the end of a lot of his parables. Many of the last shall be first, and many who are now first shall be last. This upending of things.
This dragon image, you see dragons in other parts of Scripture. Do they do
Right.
the same thing? Like
Right.
Revelation?
They come from the same place. Yeah. It's the same kind of deal. We're going to revisit this in a big way when we get to Revelations, the book of Revelation. There's going to be a dragon there who goes to all the nations and stirs them up to try to destroy God's people. Same kind of thing. So what in this little dream here, there's a lot of groundwork laid theologically. This little Greek piece here that's going to get picked up on in the New Testament in terms of what the people are expecting. We're coming up on Christmas appropriately enough. What the people are expecting, what the deliverance is that God's promising to them. Right? Because the people at the time Jesus comes, right, are looking around at the world and it looks like a pretty dark place. Right? They're ruled over by the Romans. They have no legal rights. They're oppressed. Right? And they're looking at it in these terms. So they're crying out to God for deliverance. Okay? But for whatever reason, they're not seeing this pattern. Their pattern of deliverance is some general's going to rise up and overthrow the Romans and then everything will be okay. Right? They're not looking for light. They're not looking for the sun to rise. They're not looking for these streams of water. They're definitely not looking for the people who are now the high-ups to get laid low and the people, right? So Jesus comes and he preaches exactly this, right? These are all themes. I am the light of the world, right? And the streams of living water. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. This is exactly what Jesus comes preaching. It's exactly the deliverance God promised. And the people don't see it. Okay, but here it is. Here it is. Okay, so Mordecai has this vision. He says, I'm going to have to think about this some. Right? So he he spends the day thinking about it. Okay. Now 1M. Then Mordecai rested in the courtyard with Gabbatha and Thara, the king's two eunuchs who guarded the courtyard. He overheard their words and considered their anxieties, and he realized they were preparing to lay hands upon the king, and he informed the king about them. Okay. We've talked before about eunuchs. Right? It was very common in ancient areas. The Egyptians did this too, the Ethiopians did this too. The Persians did this, where the most high-ranking officials, in order to be in that position, the emperor or the king would have the man castrated. You say, that seems mean. Right? Who would apply for that job? Well, the idea was, if he's castrated, he can't have children. Right? He can't really have a wife or a family. All those things were the things that we talked about. That was sort of people's sense of immortality, their sense of legacy. Right? You'd have a son to carry on your name, carry on your family. Well, if you can't have children and you can't have a family, What's the only way that this man now has to make a name for himself or prosper? But being loyal to the king. Right? He's now totally dependent on the king. So that was the idea. So the idea was, because of that, he'll have undivided loyalties. Undivided loyalties. There's not going to be anything, you can come and offer him money. What's he going to do with money? Provide for his non-existent family? Right? So that was the idea. So two of these eunuchs, two of these high officials are talking in the courtyard. Mordecai's there kind of resting and taking a nap, but he overhears them plotting that they're going to try and overthrow the king, probably to install someone else who they like better. So Mordecai goes and informs the king that they're plotting against him. Then the king interrogated the two eunuchs, and they confessed and were led away to be executed. The king made a memorandum of these matters, and Mordecai also wrote about these matters. And the king commanded Mordecai to serve in the court, and he gave him gifts for his service. But Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagthite was held in high honor before the king, and he sought for ways to bring harm to Mordecai and his people because of the two eunuchs of the king. Okay, so now we get introduced to the last character. Okay, we've got Mordecai, who's a servant of Xerxes. Okay, now we meet our friend, who's not really our friend, Haman. Haman is an Agagthite, meaning he's from one of the other conquered peoples. He's also not really Persian. Okay, and Haman is another servant of the king who apparently was friends with these two eunuchs. Maybe he was even part of this original plot. So he's now decided it's his goal in life to get it over on Mordecai. Okay, so this is the Bible version of Game of Thrones. If you ever watched that, but this is now Haman is now plotting against Mordecai. His goal is now he's gonna succeed over Mordecai and get revenge for what happened to these two eunuchs. Okay, so now we arrive at verse 1. We catch up with the folks who have the Aramaic version. So 1:1, it came to pass after these matters in the days of Xerxes. This is the same Xerxes who reigned over the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In the days when King Xerxes sat on the throne in the city of Susa, that in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a feast for his friends and the rest of the nations, and for the nobles of the Persians and the Medes and the chiefs of the satraps. And after these things, that is, after he had displayed the wealth of his kingdom and the glory of the joy of his riches for 180 days, so 6 months, right? 6 months he throws a celebration of himself, right? He invites all the officials, all the empire to come and glory at how great he is. So after 6 months, when the days of the celebration were completed, the king set forth a banquet in the court of the king's palace for 6 days for the people living in the city. The courtyard was adorned with fine white linen curtains stretched out on cords of purple and fastened to square gold and silver studs on pillars of marble and stone. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of emerald stone, mother of pearl and marble, and transparent coverings variously adorned with colorful flowers and encircled with embroidered roses. There were gold and silver cups, and a ruby goblet set out, worth 30,000 talents. And there was an abundance of sweet wine, which the king himself drank. Now this banquet was not in keeping with established law, but this is what the king desired. And he ordered all the stewards of his household, those of his men, to do his will. Queen Vashti also provided a place for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. And don't think that these descriptions, when they're listing all this stuff, is exaggeration. Because Xerxes in particular was fairly infamous. Even the Greeks who hated him and were at war with him admitted he knew how a king ought to live. Right? They were sort of in awe of the Persian emperors. So when they put on a display, they put on a display. Okay? And he really did control territory from India to Ethiopia, and could have anything he wanted brought to his capital at any time. So when they talk about the riches of the nations, animals, emerald and mother of pearl mosaics and this kind of thing. That's all. That's just description. It's not exaggeration at all.
A patron of the arts.
Yeah. So verse 10, now on the 7th day the king was merry, meaning drunk, and told Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs, the servants of King Xerxes. Those are not saints' names. So I know some of you wanted to name a child Bigtha or Carcass, but they're not... So he orders the 7 eunuchs to bring the queen before him, to enthrone her, and to place the royal crown upon her, to show her beauty to the rulers and the nations, for she was beautiful. So he showed off the stuff, he showed off the house, now he's going to show off his wife. Right? That's what a beautiful wife he has. But Queen Vashti did not heed his words and refused to come with the eunuchs. The king was distressed and angry. Distressed and angry is sort of a... He was... quite upset. and Xerxes, again, we just read this description of him, not the kind of guy you want to tick off, especially when he's drunk. Right? The king said to his friends, thus has Vashti spoken, follow the law and justice concerning this. And Archeseos, Sarsatheos, and Memucan, the nobles of the Persians and Medes, those near to the king and first in rank by the king, went to him. They reported to him what according to the laws was to be done to the queen Vashti, because she did not do as commanded by King Xerxes by way of the eunuchs. And Memucan said to the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the king's rulers and nobles. So they're saying, look, by refusing to come out, she hasn't just disobeyed you, king, she's dishonored all of us, by all of us not getting to see her. He reported the words of the queen and how she contradicted the king and how she disobeyed King Xerxes. Thus today the royal ladies of the rulers of the Persians and the Medes, hearing the words which were spoken to the king, will dare to dishonor their husbands in the same way. Here's where we get to the real problem. Yeah. They find out that the king's wife can tell him to go pound sand. Right? What chance has Shlomo the farmer got with his wife, out in farmland? Verse 19, if it pleases the king, let it make a royal decree, and let it be written according to the laws of the Persians and the Medes. And let it not be declared otherwise, that the queen no longer come before him, and let the king give her royal position to a woman better than she. Okay, so this is the response. Here's what you need to do. You need to make someone else queen. Tell her to buzz off. Find somebody better.
Better meaning...
obedient, but in Xerxes, you got to flatter Xerxes, so you could do better. You could do better. We can find somebody better looking and better. Verse 20, and let the decree of the king which he shall have made be proclaimed throughout his kingdom, and thus all wives will honor their husbands from the poor to the rich. Right? So they're saying, and we'll put this news out, and so all them women will know that if they talk back to their husbands can get rid of them too. Right? That's the
men are working on.
Now remember, as we read this, remember what Christ said. He who puts off his wife and marries another commits adultery. To which all the apostles said, this is a hard teaching. So verse 21, and the word pleased the king and the nobles, and the king did just as Memucan had said. He then sent out to his entire kingdom throughout the provinces according to their own languages, that husbands be feared in their own houses. Okay. Now let me point out here, the book of Esther has become very popular recently in Protestant circles. I don't know if you know this.
Oh, really?
Okay. There have been big budget movie productions. Okay. Sermon series on the radio. And most of it is really bad.
Yeah.
What is new?
Most of it is really bad. Most of it is that there's a type of biblical interpretation that's called exemplarism. Okay? And it's called that because what you do is you take some figure in the Bible, right, and use them as an exemplar, meaning you tell people, be like so-and-so. Right? Be like so-and-so. Now, we've already seen some of the problems with this, but I'll give an example. I come to you and I say, be like David.
You're in trouble.
Okay, well, be like David what? David was courageous when he stood up to Goliath, right? He was a man after God's own heart, right? That's good. He committed adultery and murder. Well, there we don't want to be like David, right? There we want to be not like David. But after he did, he repented, and there we do want to be. So it's more complex than that, right? We're reading stories about real human beings, and real human beings are complex, right? So you can't just say, imitate, so-and-so and everything. But that is the frame of interpretation that's used, okay? And I feel the need to mention that here because already we've seen something where they're going to say, see, look, women should obey their husbands in their household. If your husband tells you to come out and sit on display in front of all his friends, you should do it. They're not going to go that far, but they're going to say, they're going to use this to argue, see, this should be king. And they're going to go farther. As we go farther, we're going to see Esther is going to perfume herself before she meets the king. And you will hear people, you will hear ministers in sermon series say, see, this is God saying women should make themselves look beautiful for their husbands. Right?
Go back to those ads in the 50s,
Yeah.
Make sure you're dressed when your husband comes home.
Right. And that's not, as we're going to see from the text, that's clearly not what the Bible is trying to say. Right? They've come into it with an idea in their heads already, right, of what they want the Bible to say about it. And they're latching on to sort of superficial things. Okay? Now, I don't care how big you are on exemplarist interpretation, no one is ever going to tell a Christian, be like Xerxes. Okay? He's a pagan emperor. Okay? He's a pagan emperor. And at no point in this book is he held up as being a role model, right, or object lesson. So clearly, here in chapter 1, when he sends out this edict, we should say the opposite of saying, yeah, you tell him, Xerxes, right? It's the exact opposite. It's like, wow, this is someone who doesn't understand love between a man and a woman the way it's been presented to us so far in the Old Testament. Right? Remember in Genesis, Isaac and Rebekah were held up as sort of the paradigm of what a relationship should be. Why? Well, for one thing, Isaac only had one wife. And number two, because he loved her, his one wife. Right? We go through this whole thing with Abraham and Sarah based on Abraham learning how he should treat his wife. Right? Over and over again, when Abraham fell into sin, it was because, God gives Sarah the new name Sarah that means princess. And it takes Abraham a long time to learn to treat her that way. Right? We've been presented already with this image, and it's sort of summed up. It's summed up in the Troparion for the forefathers that we heard today in church. That Christ saved the forefathers, the Old Testament saints, by faith, in order that through them he could betroth the church to himself before time. Meaning, it's pointing ahead to the ultimate example of what marriage is supposed to be, which we'll get in Ephesians, which we'll talk about 3 years from now or so, where Christ and his church are the image of what a marriage is supposed to be. Okay. Xerxes and Vashti does not resemble Christ and his church. It's the opposite, right? He's treating her the way he treats all the other subjects in his empire. He's God. Everyone else is not. So you will obey him and do what he wants.
Did they ever hold up Judas The one who seduces the guy?
No, Judith isn't in the Protestant Old Testament, remember? But so this is the antithesis. This is the antithesis, right? He's putting away his wife because she disobeyed him, which Christ expressly says this is a good example of adultery. Right? This is not being held up as quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. Okay. But so now as we go on, and we get to these other little examples, the perfuming and stuff, once again, that's a very shallow, and even down to they've got stuff aimed at teenage girls telling them this. Like, beauty tips from the book of Esther. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I wish I didn't have to. But it's true. I mean, that's how you see Esther. So now let's get back into Esther and start looking at what Esther actually is about. It actually is saying. So chapter 2, after these words, the wrath of the king subsided, and he no longer mentioned Vashti, remembering either what she had said or how he had condemned her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to the city of Susa into the women's quarters, under the custody of the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them." Okay, so one of the eunuch's job is he's the custodian of the women. It's especially important that he be a eunuch, right? If he's going to be the custodian of the women. What that means, custodian of the women, is that this isn't Xerxes' only wife. Okay, Xerxes much like David and Solomon and all these others, has a harem. Right? He has a group of women who he sleeps with, and one of the eunuchs is in charge of dealing with them. Okay, so they say, let's go out, recruit a new crop of virgins, bring them all in, give them a makeover, let the king take his pick. Verse 4, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jewish man in the city of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who was an exile from Jerusalem, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had taken captive. He had raised the daughter of Abihail, his father's brother, and her name was Esther, and when her parents died, he brought her up to be his wife, and she was beautiful. Okay. Now, at first this sounds kind of creepy. Brought her up to be his wife. That sounds kind of disturbing. The idea, because we already know that Mordecai is a very old man, right? But the idea here is that what he's trying to do is actually an honorable thing. Okay, because his friends, this couple, only had this one child and then passed away. So there's no one carrying on their family line at all. They just have this daughter. Okay. Furthermore, this daughter is exiled in Persia. Okay. So the idea here is that he is an older man, is betrothed to her, one, to protect her from getting married off outside the Jewish community, and number two, potentially when she's an adult, they could theoretically produce a male heir who could carry on both families. Right? So within the culture at the time, he's not being a creepy old man. He's trying to carry on these two. He's trying to do an honorable thing. He's trying to do right by his friend who's passed away.
It's sort of like Joseph.
So there is a parallel there too. Again, we're coming up on the Feast of the Nativity. Tradition tells us that St. Joseph was an older man, and that it was a similar kind of arrangement to this that was made for the Theotokos. When she came of age and could no longer live in the temple, she was betrothed to Joseph, this older man whose wife had passed away, who already had children, to protect her and take care of her. He was known to be an honorable man. So there's a similar thing going on. Okay. So verse 8, so when the king's ordinance was heard, many young maidens were gathered together in the city of Susa under the custody of Hegai. And Esther was brought to Hegai, the custodian of the women. And the young woman pleased him and found favor in his sight. He hastened to give beauty treatments to her and her portion, and the 7 young maidens appointed to her from the palace. He himself treated her and her maidservants well in the women's quarters. But Esther did not reveal her people or her family, for Mordecai charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai walked about the courtyard of the women to see what would happen to Esther. Okay, so he goes to round up all the eligible young bachelorettes. One of them who's caught up in the roundup is Esther. Okay, so she's brought in and given the beauty treatments, the Persian makeover. And she's assigned these 7 attendants, these 7 maidservants to follow her around. And now the idea is Xerxes is going to take a look at all the contestants and pick one of them to be the new queen.
He took her in as his daughter. You're saying that?
Mordecai did.
Yeah.
Right. Xerxes is the one who's
I know, but
looking to marry.
a while ago you said that, like he was going to go with her or something, be his wife.
Well, it said that he brought her up to be his wife.
Okay, then it's his daughter.
Yeah, that's why I was saying it was sort of both.
Okay.
He was raising her, but the idea was that in addition to protecting her, he might also eventually produce a male heir for the 2 families. So verse 12, now this was the time for a young woman to go in to the king, after she had completed 12 months, for thus are the days of preparation fulfilled. Okay, so she spent a whole year getting prepped, 6 months being anointed with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and beauty treatments for women. Okay. This is not saying you should be engaged for 1 year before you get married. Okay. That's not the point. The point is that she went through all of the pampering involved in this process.
But if you are going to get married, you should spend 6 months in a health spa.
Well, see, the thing you have to remember here is, we like to modernize it. We like to modernize it and think, oh wow, she's getting pampered at a health spa for 12 months. How wonderful that would be. Again, think about when we're talking about in history. We're talking about the 5th century BC. Okay? She's a slave. She's not there voluntarily. Right? She's not there voluntarily. She doesn't get to choose what happens to her, where she gets to go, what beauty treatment she gets. Okay? If Xerxes or one of his high officials comes in and wants to have sex with her, she's having sex with him or she's dead. Okay? So you can make all the movies you want to, making this seem really romantic. It's not really romantic. You got to go back into the reality. Right? She's a slave. Okay? He owns her and is going to do with her whatever he wants to do with her.
There's nothing she can
And she has no say in any of this. Neither does Mordecai, for that matter. Right? So that's why Mordecai is hanging around the temple, keeping an eye on her, hoping nothing bad's going to happen to her. Right? So verse 13, after this she goes to the king, and she shall be allowed to bring whatever she asks with her from the women's quarters into the royal palace. She enters in the evening, and towards daybreak she departs quickly to the 2nd women's quarters, where Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, is the guardian of the women. And she does not go into the king again unless she should be called by name. Okay, so this is part of the process. All right, so she gets brought in, king gets to look at her, then they take her to this other quarters, right, where she spends the night, unless the king decides he wants to call her back for further inquiry / testing. Verse 15, now when the time came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, to go into the king, she neglected nothing which the king's eunuch, the guardian of the women, commanded. Now Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther went into King Xerxes in the 10th month, which is Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther, and she found favor beyond all the other virgins, and he placed the queen's crown on her. And the king gave a banquet for all his friends and nobles for 7 days, and he exalted the marriage feast of Esther, and granted a release to those under his reign. That granted a release means they had a tax holiday. by the way. That was how you knew the king was in a really good mood. As he said, during this period, no one has to pay taxes. So for the whole week, no one had to pay him taxes. And Mordecai was serving in the courtyard. Now Esther had not revealed her heritage, just as Mordecai commanded her when she was with him, which is to fear God and to keep his commandments. And Esther did not change her manner of life. Why do they make that last note? Remember, this is taking place at the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah. What was the huge sin that the returnees committed in Judah that had Ezra in sackcloth and ashes repenting? They married people who weren't Jewish, right? Well, what did Esther just do? Albeit against her will.
Married a non-Jew.
She just married a Persian. Right? She just married a Persian. So the point here is, even in the king's court, even as the queen, she is still following, and even though she hasn't told anyone she's Jewish, she hasn't made a point of it, she's still following the Lord, she's still following the law. She isn't changing the way she lives her life. Okay? Regardless of the fact that. Okay, now, again, we've got to roll back 5th century. What this is telling us is not just that she stayed Jewish. This is telling us she placed her life in danger. Right?
Have her beheaded.
Right? Yeah. She's now the queen. Remember what happened to the last queen who didn't do what he wanted? Right? Who was stubborn. Thought she could make her own decisions. Well, she's sticking with what she knows to be right, even though at some point that may not very well appeal to him. Right? So she's literally risking her life every day by staying Jewish, by staying true to God. Verse 21, now 2 of the king's eunuchs, the chiefs of the bodyguards, were furious because Mordecai had been promoted, and they sought to kill King Xerxes. And the matter was made known to Mordecai, and he informed Esther, and she made the details of the plot known to the king. The king examined the 2 eunuchs and hanged them. The king then ordered that a record remembering the goodwill of Mordecai be placed in the royal library. This seems to be returning and telling the same story that we got in the prologue, right? The Greek prologue, minus the dream. Minus the dream. Chapter 3, after these things, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and elevated him and set his seat above all his friends. All those in the court bowed to him, and thus the king commanded, but Mordecai refused to bow to him. Okay, so now we're back. Remember our friend Haman, was kind of in it with the 2 eunuchs, not real happy about Mordecai being there. Well, Haman's been put in this elevated position by the king, and the king says, you respect Haman the way you respect me. Right? So everyone bow down before him when he comes. Mordecai won't bow down before him. So verse 3, then those in the court said to Mordecai, Mordecai, why do you ignore the king's command? They said this to him daily, but he did not listen to them. And they informed Haman that Mordecai resisted the words of the king, and that Mordecai had revealed to them that he was a Jew. When Haman learned that Mordecai did not bow to him, he became exceedingly angry, and he determined to destroy all the Jews of the kingdom of Xerxes. And he made a decree in the 12th year of the reign of Xerxes, and he cast lots to determine the precise day and month to destroy the race of Mordecai on a single day. And the lot fell on the 14th day of the month, which is the month of Adar. Okay. So, Haman, being a bit full of himself, right, and angry at Mordecai, finds out, well, the reason he's not bowing down before me, right, is that he's not going to bow down before a human being. He's not going to worship a human being because he only worships God Yahweh, right? Well, we need to get rid of not just him, but all of his people who don't respect the king. Okay? So, he's talking about exterminating. Keep in mind how big Xerxes' kingdom has become. He's talking about exterminating all of the Jewish survivors. Because they've got control of Egypt. They've got control of Palestine, where Judah is trying to rebuild. They've got control of the Persian Empire, where there are still refugees living. We talked about all we've got left is the tribe of Judah, part of the tribe of Benjamin, some Levites. Okay? And this is going to be it. Wiped off the face of the earth. If Haman has his way. And so he casts lots. He consults his pagan god to decide when we're gonna kill everyone. So verse 8, then Haman spoke to King Xerxes, saying, there is a certain people scattered among the peoples throughout your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other people, and they disregard the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let him make a decree to destroy them. If so, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the king's treasury. So the king took off his signet ring and placed it into the hand of Haman in order to seal what was written against the Jews. The king said to Haman, keep the silver and deal with those people as you wish. So Haman offers the king this huge sum of money to let him wipe out the Jews. And the king says, hey, if they don't obey my laws, have at them. Right? No need to pay me. Now, this is an important shift. This is an important shift. Because up until now we've been reading about, for the most part, the Jewish people living somewhat independently. Right? And the issue has been whether they're going to obey God or not. Right? Whether they're going to follow the Torah, the teachings that God has given them, or whether they're going to act like the other nations. Okay? But now we have this shift in situations where we've got the power, the earthly power, Xerxes, who rules most of the world. Right? Rules most of the earth at this time in history. Okay? And the question for the Jews is, are they going to obey him or are they going to obey God? Which set of laws are they going to follow? And not only that, but you've got a civil authority here at Xerxes who very much wants it to be him. Okay, who's demanding that it's going to be him. And this is going to be the story, this is going to be the reality of the story of not just Jewish people, but of the first generations of Christians until Constantine. Okay, the reason we have so many martyrs from the time of Christ until Constantine's conversion, to the beginning of the 300s, okay, is because what it came down to for Christians was, is Caesar the Lord of the heavens and the earth, or is Christ the Lord of the heavens and the earth? Okay, and picking Christ meant Caesar was going to kill you. This goes all the way back here. Is Xerxes the Lord of the heavens and the earth? Or is Yahweh the Lord of the heavens and the earth? And if you pick Yahweh, Xerxes is going to kill you. And we're going to see as we get into the Maccabees, under the Greeks, under the Romans, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be the same thing. Okay. So it's moved from God merely telling them, look, if you're disobedient, you're going to be destroyed. And that coming true, but then not necessarily believing it, to right in their face. Right in their face as a day-to-day reality, being killed. And there are still Christians up to this day who face that in various parts of the world. And last century there were millions of Christians who faced that in the communist parts of the world. But still today in Muslim parts of the world, in India, there are plenty of places where you get your pick. You can serve Jesus and die, or you can serve whoever has set themselves up as Lord in that kingdom. And so for us, it's still the theoretical stage. You know, there's probably not someone pointing a gun at us, saying, who are you going to follow? Our destiny still depends on it, but we can be theoretical about it and not think about it and sort of push the decision away in terms of who we're going to follow. But it becomes a reality for people here and then throughout history afterwards. So verse 12, then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and they wrote as Haman commanded to the commanders and the governors in the 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia, and to the rulers of the nations in their own language. They wrote in the name of King Xerxes. The letter was sent by couriers throughout the kingdom of Xerxes to utterly destroy the race of the Jews on a single day in the 12th month, which is Adar, and to plunder their possessions. The following is a copy of the letter. Now this part isn't in the copy of the letter is not in Bibles other than the Orthodox Study Bible. This is another thing that's in the Greek. The great King Xerxes, to the rulers of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, and who hold authority under him, thus decrees: ruling over many nations and having gained dominion over all the world, not motivated by the power of authority, but ever conducting myself in moderation and unceasing gentleness. Right? Notice the way he talks about himself. Even though I rule the world, I'm not acting out of just pride, over my own greatness. No, as always. Right? I come to you with graciousness and gentleness. I was desiring to make the lives of my subjects continually tranquil, and to maintain the kingdom calm and safe to its farthest borders, and to restore the peace desired by all men. But when I inquired of my counselors how this should be done, Haman, who excels in good sense among us, and has been shown unwavering in goodwill and unshakable in fidelity, and has attained the second place in the kingdom, made known to us that there is a race of people full of ill will, who are mixed in with all the other races throughout the whole world, whose laws are contrary to all the other nations, and they continually disregard the ordinances of the kings. Thus the joint administration, blamelessly administered by us, cannot be performed. Right? I can't continue to bless you people, right, with my rule because of these misfits who won't follow our laws. Therefore we have determined that this people alone is in opposition to every other person, entertaining a strange code of laws and not disposed to our affairs, and perpetrating the worst evils, and thus the kingdom is not able to experience stability. Therefore we have designated all those made known to you in the letters written by Haman, who is appointed over such matters, and who is our second father, to root out and destroy all of them with their wives and children, without any mercy, sparing no one, on the 14th day of the 12th month Adar of this present year, that this race of people, both from before and until now hostile to us, violently going down to death in one day, may afterwards secure for us a time that is tranquil and an undisturbed state of affairs. Okay? You can find plenty of letters from Caesars, from Stalin, from rulers ever since. They're basically the same tone. Right? The Christians are the troublemakers. Right? They're the ones causing all the upheaval. They're the ones who won't go along with the program. We have a wonderful program of progress set before us, and there are these Christians who are obstinate and standing in the way. So when we just get rid of them, then everything will be joyous and tranquil, and there will be no more speed bumps. Verse 14, copies of the letters were published throughout every province, and an order was given to all nations to be ready on that day. The matter was quickly dispatched also in Susa, and the king and Haman were drinking, but the city was troubled. Chapter 4, but Mordecai, learning what had happened, tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, and sprinkled ashes on himself. And running through the square of the city, he cried out with a loud voice, a people who have done no wrong are about to be destroyed. He went as far as the king's gate, and there he waited, for it was not allowed for him to enter the courtyard wearing sackcloth and covered in ashes. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The queen's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and she was deeply distressed upon hearing of this situation. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, her eunuch who attended to her, and sent him out to learn for herself the details from Mordecai. Mordecai made known to him what had happened, and the offer Haman had made to the king to put 10,000 talents into the treasury to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the decree posted in Susa concerning their destruction, to show it to Esther. He told him to instruct her to go into the king and make supplication before him, and to plead before him for the people, remembering, said he, the days of your low estate, and how you were raised by my hand, because Haman, second to the king, spoke against us for our death. Call upon the Lord and speak to the king concerning us, and to deliver us from death. So Hathach came and told her all these words. So Mordecai goes into mourning. Right? He makes this display. Right? He's not allowed to come in before the king because he's wearing sackcloth and he's covered in ashes and he's filthy. Okay? So Esther tries to send him some new clothes so he can come in and speak to the king. And he basically refuses and says, no, you need to go. You're the queen. Right? Clearly, he likes you. You need to go to him and try and get him to change his mind. Verse 10, then Esther said to Hathach, go to Mordecai and say, all the nations of the kingdom know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been summoned, there is no deliverance for him unless the king holds out his golden scepter to save that person. And I have not been called to go into the king for 30 days. So Hathach related all Esther's words to Mordecai. Again, this is a reality check on the situation. Right? We read it now today and say, oh yeah, just go ask your husband a favor. Right? No, with Xerxes, if you walked into Xerxes' room uninvited, you were put to death. Right? Unless by happenstance, for whatever reason, he decided to spare you. Okay? Again, she's a slave. Okay? So she says, he hasn't called me in 30 days. I don't know that that's a good idea. Right? If I just go barging in there, he's liable to just execute me, and that won't get us anywhere. Verse 13, and Mordecai said to Hathach, go and say to Esther, do not say to yourself that you alone will be saved in the kingdom apart from all the other Jews. For if you choose not to heed this request at this time, help and deliverance for the Jews will arise elsewhere, but you and your father's house will perish. Besides, who knows whether it is for this occasion you reign as queen? So, what's his argument? Number one, right, if they find out you're a Jew, they're going to kill you anyway. Right? Number two, if they don't find out you're a Jew, notice Mordecai's faith here. God will deliver us some other way. God will save us some other way. But because you refuse to help, right, it'll be you and your family that will suffer for not having been faithful to God, to what God wanted. And then third, maybe this is why, out of all the virgin women in the Persian Empire, it was you that was picked to be queen. Maybe just for this moment, so that you could speak to the king. Verse 15, then Esther dispatched the one who came to her to Mordecai, saying, go and assemble together the Jews in Susa. Fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 full days and 3 full nights. I and my maids will also fast. Then I will go to the king contrary to the law, even if I am to perish. So Mordecai went and did all that Esther commanded him. Okay. So again, this isn't just, Ricky's going to be angry at me if I tell him I bought these shoes, right? This is her facing now the real possibility of death to try to save her people. So now there's another little chunk here that's not in the it's not in the Aramaic. 17a it's labeled here. He being Mordecai, then beseeched the Lord, remembering all the works of the Lord, and said, O Lord, Lord Almighty King, all things are under your power, and there is no one to oppose you in your desire to save Israel. For you have made heaven and the earth and every wondrous thing under heaven, and you are the Lord of all, and there is no one who shall resist you, Lord. Who's that aimed at? It's Yahweh who made the heavens and the earth. It's Yahweh who is the Lord. No one can resist you. Right? There isn't going to be a fight between Yahweh and Xerxes. Yahweh is going to get his way, Xerxes can lump it. Right? No matter how powerful he is. You know all things. You know, O Lord, that it is not out of disrespect or arrogance or love of honor that I did this, to refuse to bow down to the haughty Haman. For I would have been happy to kiss the soles of his feet for the salvation of Israel. For I did this in order that I not place the glory of man above the glory of God. I will not bow down to anyone but you, my Lord, and I will not do these things out of arrogance. And now, O Lord God, King, God of Abraham, save your people, for they look upon us for our destruction, and they desire to destroy your inheritance from the beginning. Do not disregard your portion which you redeemed for yourself out of the land of Egypt. Hear my prayer and be merciful to your inheritance. Turn our mourning into feasting, so we may live and hymn your name, O Lord. Do not destroy the mouth of those who praise you. Then all Israel cried out with all their might, for their death was before their eyes. And Queen Esther, seized with the agony of death, fled to the Lord for refuge. And removing her royal garments, she put on the garments of distress and mourning. Instead of the magnificent perfumes, she covered her head with ashes and dirt. She humbled her body exceedingly. She set aside everything of her worldly joy, and her hair was unkempt. She implored the Lord God of Israel and said, now let's pause for a minute. I know this isn't in the version the Protestant preachers have read. Okay. But the big deal they make about the makeup and the perfuming and the looking beautiful for the husband. Well,
Guess what?
here we have the exact opposite. Here we have the exact opposite. When it comes down to it for her and her faith in God, it's repentance that she's about. Right? It's not about looking beautiful for her husband. That's not one of Esther's core values as a person. Okay? One of her core values as a person is humbling herself before the Lord when she needs His help. One of the core values of her person is when she's staring down death, she goes to God for refuge and safety and comfort. Okay? This is what Esther, if we're going to say be like Esther, this is how you need to be like Esther. Not looking nice for hubby. Okay? $17K. Oh my Lord, you alone are our King. Once again, Yahweh is our King alone. This guy can call himself whatever title he wants. Help me who am alone and have no help but you, for my risk of danger is in my hand. I have heard from my birth in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, chose Israel out of all the nations, and our fathers out of all their ancestors, for an everlasting inheritance, and do for them whatever you have spoken. Now we sinned before you, and you have delivered us into the hands of our enemies because we have worshipped their gods, O Lord. You are righteous. Remember, as I pointed out again and again in this, the first part of repentance is saying God's right in His judgment. Right? That's where she starts. She says, we're in exile. We deserve to be in exile. You did these things for us. You chose us out of all the nations. You brought us out of Egypt, and we did wrong. But now they are not satisfied with the bitter state of our bondage, but they have pledged to their idols to abolish the decree you have spoken and to destroy your inheritance, to close the mouths of those who praise you and to extinguish the glory of your temple and your altar, and to open the mouths of the heathen to proclaim the virtues of their false gods and to extol a human king forever. O Lord, do not give your scepter over to those who are not. Right? What's that talking about? The gods. Right? These gods that don't exist. Do not let them laugh at our fall, but turn their counsel against themselves and make an example of the one who rules against us. Remember us, O Lord, manifest yourself in the time of our affliction, and encourage me, O King of gods and ruler over every power. Grant to my mouth proper words in the presence of the lion to turn his heart to a hatred of our enemy, so that he and those agreeing with him may perish. Save us by your hand, and help me who am alone and have no one but you, O Lord. You know all things, and you know I hate the glory of the lawless, and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of every foreigner. What's she saying there? She hasn't slept with him. Okay? He may have forced her to marry him, but she hasn't slept with him. You know my necessity, for I abhor the symbol of my proud station which is upon my head on the days when I appear in public, as if it were a menstrual rag, and I do not wear it on the days I am alone. So much for the perfumes and the dressing up. Right? She looks on all the fineries of being a queen. She's saying that means nothing to me. Right? Those robes are like a used menstrual tissue. Right? I cast them aside. I don't wear them when I don't have to. Right? She says, you know my necessity. You know I'm a slave. You know I don't have any choice. Your handmaid has not eaten at the table of Haman, nor have I honored the banquet of the king, nor drunk the wine of libations. Neither has your handmaid rejoiced since the day of her elevation, except in you, O Lord God of Abraham. O God, who have power over all, hear the voice of us in despair, and deliver us from the hand of those acting wickedly, and deliver me from my fear. Now we're caught up back again here at the beginning of chapter 5. And it happened on the third day when she ceased praying, she took off the garments of the solemnity and put on her glorious apparel. And having become resplendent, appealing to the all-seeing God and Savior, she took with her 2 of her favorite maids. Upon the one she leaned as an elegant woman, and the other maid followed behind her bearing her train. She was aglow in the perfection of her beauty. Her face was as radiant as it was lovely, but her heart shrank with fear. And having entered through all the doors, she stood face to face with the king. He was sitting on his royal throne, clothed in all his glorious apparel, covered with gold and precious stones. He was awesome. And as he looked up, resplendent in his glory, at the very edge of anger, the queen collapsed, her complexion paled, and she slumped against the head of the maid who went before her. So he's there in his finery. He looks up and he's angry. Why? I didn't call for you to come in here. Again, not exactly a love story. Right? Not exactly a love story. What are you doing in here, woman? I should have you killed. Okay, so she faints, essentially. Verse 6, but God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness, and full of great concern he leapt from his throne and held her in his arms until she recovered. He comforted her with calming words and said to her, Esther, what is it? I am your brother, be of good cheer. You are not going to die because of this usual ordinance. Come near. And lifting his golden scepter, he laid it upon her neck, and he embraced her and said, speak to me. So he's so romantic and sweet, he lets her live. Even though she came in uncalled for. And she said to him, I saw you, my Lord, as an angel of God, and my heart was troubled for fear of your majesty. For you, my Lord, are awesome, and your face is full of kindness. But while she was speaking to him, she fainted. The king was troubled, and all his servants comforted her. And the king said, what do you want, Esther? What is your request? It shall be granted to you even up to half my kingdom. Where does that ring a bell from? Anybody? Herod. That's what Herod says after his daughter-in-law comes in, dances seductively in front of him. Verse 12, then Esther said, today is my special day. If therefore it pleases the king, let both you and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for today. And the king said, have Haman hasten here, that we may do what Esther asks. They both came to the banquet of which Esther spoke. Okay. So Esther says, I'm gonna lay out a dinner for everybody. I want you and Haman to come. You know, Haman's the second top guy. Verse 14, so at the banquet the king said to Esther, what is it, Queen Esther? Whatever you desire will be granted to you. And she said, my request and my petition is this. If I find favor in the sight of the king, let the king and Haman also come tomorrow to the banquet which I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do the same. So Haman went out from the king overjoyed and cheerful. But when Haman saw Mordecai the Jew in the court, he was enraged. Having entered his own home, he called his friends and his wife Zeresh. And he showed them his wealth and the honor the king had bestowed upon him, how he had made him to be first and chief in the kingdom. Haman added, the queen invited no one else to be with the king at the banquet except me, and I am also invited tomorrow. But these things do not please me when I see Mordecai the Jew in the courtyard. Right? So after showing off to his friends and neighbors, he says, the only two people invited to the banquet tonight were Xerxes and me. He said, but I can't even enjoy how wonderful my life is when I have to see that Jew wandering around out there in the courtyard. Then Zeresh, his wife and friends, said to him, have a tree cut down 50 cubits high, and in the morning speak to the king, and let Mordecai be hanged on the tree. But go with the king to the banquet and be merry. Haman liked what they said, and the tree was made ready. So here's a little more of the type of man Haman is and his friends are. You know, they look out, they say, yeah, having that Jew wandering around is kind of a killjoy. Why don't you just have him hung? Just have him executed. Then we can celebrate how wonderful you are in peace without interruption.
Of course, nobody asked where that image goes to.
Well, hold on. Chapter 6. But the Lord made it difficult for the king to sleep that night. And the king commanded his servants to bring in the written records of notable events. And he found the written records about Mordecai, how he had told the king about the 2 eunuchs of the king, when they were keeping guard and sought to lay hands on Xerxes. Then the king said, "Has any honor or favor been granted Mordecai?" And the king's servant said, "Nothing was done for him." Right? So he's troubled in his sleep. He says, "I feel like I'm missing something." Right? So he has to haul out the records to go through all the events of the court. Did I forget something? Was there something I was supposed to do that I forgot to do? And he comes upon this point where Mordecai had turned in these 2 guys who were plotting against the king. He said, "Did we do anything for Mordecai? Would he to thank him for that?" They're like, "No." Verse 4, "And at the same time the king asked about the goodwill of Mordecai. Behold, Haman entered the courtyard. The king said, 'Who is in the courtyard?' Haman had come in to talk to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared. And the king's servant said, 'Behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard.' And the king said, 'Let him come in.' The king said to Haman, 'What should I do for a man whom I wish to honor?' And Haman thought to himself, 'Whom would the king wish to honor but me?'" Class act, that, Haman. I'm assuming you mean me. What would I like? So Haman said to the king, "As for the man whom the king wishes to honor, have the king's servant bring the royal robe the king wears along with the horse he rides. And let these be given to one of the king's honored friends. And let him clothe the man whom the king loves, and then mount him upon the horse. And let it be proclaimed in the city square, saying, 'Thus it shall be done for every man whom the king honors.' Then the king said to Haman, 'You have spoken well. Thus you shall do to Mordecai the Jew, the one serving in the courtyard, and let no word you have spoken be overlooked.'" Right? He says, "Great idea. Go do that for Mordecai." So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai with the robe and mounted him on the horse. And he went throughout the city square and proclaimed, saying, "Thus shall it be done to every man whom the king honors." You notice there's a period at the end of that one, not an exclamation point like the first one. That's not the original, but I think it's a nice touch in the translation. Mordecai returned to the courtyard, but Haman returned to his own quarters grieving with his head down. And Haman related these events to his wife Zeresh and his friends. Then his friends and wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you are beginning to fall, is of the Jewish race, you will not be able to defend against him, for the living God is with him." While they were still speaking, the king's eunuchs came to hasten Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now I have this situation where all of a sudden his wife and his friends kind of turn on him. Right? Who you begun to fall before? "Oh, it looks like Mordecai's the rising star in the court now. I think you're old news, Haman." Sorry, and besides, he's got his God on his side, so you're done. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to the banquet to drink together with the queen. And the king said to Esther on this second day of the banquet, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? What is your petition? Let it be granted to you even up to half my kingdom." Right? So he's going, "Okay, come on, these are nice dinners, right? But I know, where's this going, right? What is it you want?" She said in reply, "If I have found favor in the sight of the king, let my life be given to me at my request, and my people at my petition. For both I and my people are sold into destruction, pillage, and bondage. We and our descendants have already been enslaved as male and female slaves, and I refuse to listen to this, for the accuser of my people is not worthy of the king's court." Then the king said, "Who is this who dared to do this thing?" And Esther said, "The enemy is this wicked man Haman." Then Haman was troubled before the king and the queen. Right? So they're sitting at the table. It's him. So Haman's a little nervous. Verse 7, the king arose from the banquet and went into the garden. But Haman was pleading with the queen, for he realized that he was in desperate circumstances. Again, that's a little euphemistic, right? He knows this is real bad. This has turned around on him in a bad way. The king returned from the garden, and Haman, while entreating the queen, had fallen upon the couch. And the king said, "So, will you force yourself upon my wife in my own house?" So Haman is imploring Esther, "Please, please." And they walk in, and he sees him grabbing her. Right? He says, "Are you trying to do something with my wife?" Bad idea with Xerxes, right? And hearing this, Haman changed his countenance. Changed his face went white. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, Haman has prepared a gallows for Mordecai, the one who spoke for the benefit of the king. A gallows 50 cubits high has been set up at Haman's place." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So those cubits, that's 150 feet high. To give you an idea. And Haman was hung on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king was appeased. So Haman had one idea, and things turned around on him in a somewhat ironic way. And there are, James, as you kind of mentioned, there are some themes here that get picked up in the New Testament. Someone being accused at the dinner, who was plotting to betray, right? His betrayer ends up hanging from a gallows.
It was all done at the mealtime.
And the king said, "I will bring up to him." Well, no, that was a separate
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
That was John the Baptist.
Yeah. So chapter 8. On that day, King Xerxes gave Esther everything belonging to Haman the accuser. And Mordecai was summoned before the king because Esther made known his relationship to her. The king then took the signet ring he had taken from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. Then Esther appointed Mordecai over everything that belonged to Haman. Again she fell down at the feet of the king, and she implored him to remove all the evils Haman had done to the Jews. And the king held out his golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood beside the king and said, "If it seems good to you and I have found favor, let a letter be sent out to revoke the letters sent out by Haman, which were written to annihilate all the Jews in your kingdom. For how can I be able to look upon the oppression of my people? How will I endure the destruction of my countrymen?" Then the king said to Esther, "Since I granted you everything that belonged to Haman and hung him from the gallows because he laid hands on the Jews, what else do you want? Write it yourselves in my name as it seems good to you, and seal it with my ring. For whatever is written by command of the king and sealed with my ring cannot be revoked." So the scribes were summoned in the first month, which is Nisan, on the 23rd day of that same year. For whatever was ordered was written to the Jews, to the local governors, and to the chiefs of the satraps from India as far as Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every place according to their own language. So it was written by the authority of the king and sealed with his ring, and the letters were dispatched by couriers. As he commanded by these letters, the Jews were to exercise their own laws in every city, to be of help to each other, and to treat their adversaries and those opposing them as they wished. This was to take effect beginning on one day throughout all the kingdom of Xerxes, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar. So on the day we're supposed to all be killed, here's the decree that takes effect instead. And this is another thing that's not going to be in there. The following is a copy of the letter. The great King Artaxerxes, to the governors of the provinces and the 127 satrapies, from India to Ethiopia, to the faithful of our interests, greetings. Many of those who have been frequently honored in the great kindness of their benefactors have become high-minded. Meaning, many of the people who have been honored by the king in the past have gotten a big head about it. Haman. Right? Not only do they seek to do harm to our subjects, but being unable to bear such a measure, they undertake to plot against their own benefactors. Not only do they drive out gratitude from among men, but also being puffed up by those who are unacquainted with goodness, they suppose they will escape the vengeance of the all-seeing God. And often many of those who have been appointed to positions of authority, being entrusted to manage the affairs of friends and having been given a position of authority as an encouragement, have become accessories to the shedding of innocent blood. And they have involved them in circumstances without remedy, by deceiving with false arguments the benign kindness of the rulers. It is possible to observe this not so much from examining the ancient traditions, as by your learning from the wicked deeds accomplished in your midst by the pestilential influence of those unworthy of holding power. We must be on guard for the future, that we may maintain the kingdom undisturbed and peaceful for all the people, making the most of changes and always judging fairly in the matters coming to our attention. Thus Haman, the son of Hammedatha, a Macedonian, certainly not of our Persian blood, but differing greatly from our kindness and having been hospitably received by us. So this weird foreigner Haman, who wandered in one day and who we were gracious and showed hospitality to, received such a large share of the benevolence which we have for all peoples, that he was even publicly proclaimed to be our Father, reverenced by all. He attained the rank of second to the royal throne. But unable to bear his dignity, he endeavored to deprive us of our kingdom and our life. And by very twisted methods of deception, he demanded the destruction of our deliverer and constant benefactor Mordecai, and Esther, the blameless consort of our kingdom, together with their whole race. For through these ways he expected to catch the nation of the Persians undefended and to guide the Macedonians to victory. So, see how this has been recast. This must be what he was really up to.
Revisionist history.
This is what he must really have been up to. He must have been trying to help the Macedonians overthrow. The Macedonians being, at this point, part of the Greek city-states, and also being the place from which Alexander the Great is going to come and conquer the Persians eventually. But see, he was in it with those Macedonians trying to overthrow the king. That's why he wanted to kill the Jews. 12:0. However, we find that the Jews who have been consigned to destruction by this terribly wicked man are not criminals, but live by most just laws. We find them to be children of the Most High, most mighty, living God, who has guided the kingdom both for us and our forefathers in the most excellent manner. Therefore, you will do well to disregard the letters sent by Haman the son of Hammedatha, because he who has produced these has been hanged at the gates of Susa, along with his whole household. For God Almighty, who rules over all things, swiftly rendered a just judgment on him.
You can tell he didn't write it.
Yeah. Therefore, post a copy of this document publicly at every place, making it known that the Jews are to follow their own customs and join in supporting them, so that on the day set for their destruction, the 13th day of the 12th month Adar, they may defend themselves against those who would attack them. For God, who holds power over all things, has made this a day of gladness for them instead of a day of the destruction of a chosen race. Therefore, celebrate this outstanding day among your named feasts with all rejoicing, so that both now and in the future it may be deliverance for us and for the well-inclined Persians, and for those who plot destruction against us, a remembrance of destruction. And every city or province whatsoever which shall not act in accordance with these things shall be mercilessly destroyed with spear and fire, and shall be made impassable not only to men, but even to wild animals and birds forever. So that's getting wiped out when the birds and the animals can't even make it through. They've wiped it out so badly. Let copies of the decree be posted conspicuously throughout the kingdom, and let all the Jews be ready on that day to fight against those who oppose them. So horsemen were sent out quickly to carry out the king's commands, and the decree was also posted in Susa. Then Mordecai went out robed in royal raiment, having a gold crown and a diadem of fine purple linen. And seeing him, the people of Susa rejoiced. And there was light and gladness for the Jews. In every city and province where the decree was published, where the proclamation was posted, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, feasting and good cheer. And many of the Gentiles were circumcised and lived in the Jewish way because of fear of the Jews. Okay, so again, remember what the whole goal was originally, of the Jews being the chosen people, was that the other nations would see them and see their way of life and come to follow it too. Right? So here we see not only does God save them, but God's bringing about sort of the whole original purpose. And that some of the Persians are now coming over to worship the true God. Chapter 9, now in the 12th month, on the 13th day of the month of Adar, the decree written by the king arrived. On that day those in opposition were destroyed by the Jews. For fearing them no one resisted. For the leaders of the satraps, the sovereigns, and the royal scribes honored the Jews, and the fear of Mordecai weighed on them. For the order of the king had come down that Mordecai should be acknowledged throughout the kingdom. And in the city of Susa the Jews killed 500 men. These included Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Bajazatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. They ravaged them. On that day the number of those killed in Susa was reported to the king. So part of this, because of the previous decree, there was the realization that there are going to be people who are going to go out and try and kill Jews on this day. So part of the decree was that the Jews were allowed to defend themselves. So that when these people came to try to annihilate the Jews would be allowed to fight back and not be seen as rebelling against the king. Verse 11, then the king said to Esther, the Jews have killed 500 men in the city of Susa. How do you think they have made out in the surrounding lands? What more do you yet desire so that it will be done for you?" Esther said to the king, "Let the Jews be granted the opportunity to do the same tomorrow in order to hang the sons of Haman." And he permitted this to be done, and he set out for the Jews of the city the bodies of the sons of Haman to hang. And the Jews gathered together at Susa the 14th of Adar and killed 300 men, but they plundered nothing. Okay. So they had already killed the sons of Haman, but the idea is they go and hang the bodies. Number one, because anything that's hung from a tree is cursed, according to Deuteronomy, and to make an example out of, to show this is what happens when you try to attack God and his people. The rest of the Jews throughout the kingdom assembled and came to the aid of one another. They had rest from their enemies, for they killed 15,000 of them on the 13th of Adar. They plundered nothing. Then they rested on the 14th of that month and absorbed it as a day of rest with joy and gladness. Why do they keep pointing out that they plundered nothing? This wasn't a mob of Jews going around looting. Right? It's the idea that it was self-defense. They were defending themselves against the people who were intending to destroy them. So they didn't go and steal.
Then they would not go to wherever they lived and take what they
Right.
got.
Right. They weren't going out looking to kill and pillage. They were defending
They were doing
themselves.
what God wanted them.
Verse 17, "And the Jews of the city of Susa also gathered together on the 14th, but did not rest from their enemies. But they observed the 15th with joy and gladness. This is why the Jews scattered in every foreign land observed the 14th of Adar with gladness as a holiday, sending parcels to their neighbors. But those living in the major cities keep the 15th of Adar as a holiday, sending parcels to their neighbors." Okay. This is the origin of the Feast of Purim. Purim, which is one of the minor Jewish feast days. There's a lot of Jewish feast days, but this is what it's celebrating. It's celebrating this day when they were nearly wiped out in the Persian Empire, but were delivered.
Yes, you said that the Jews went out and killed, but they defended themselves.
Right.
I thought the king had rescinded this order.
He did, but the order had already been sent out, and preparations had been made. And so part of the order is, in addition to rescinding the order, if anyone attacks the Jews on that day, based on the previous order or whatever, intending to pillage their belongings, that the Jews had the right to defend themselves. Right? Because normally if that sort of thing happened in a Persian city, Xerxes would have sent his army in and everyone who was involved in the riot would have been killed. Right? So he's giving the Jews the right of self-defense on that day because of the order that went out.
Well, you would think if the king rescinded it that you would obey it.
Well, that's why. That's ultimately why he's giving them the right of self-defense.
Well, there was
He's saying the Jews can kill those people because those people are defying the king's order. Is really what he's saying. And since they're defying the king's order, they get put to death.
And if they know the Jews have the right to defend themselves, and they've also received rest in the second order.
Right.
So they're not ignorant.
Yeah.
In the footnotes here, it says that the Persian king's orders can't be revoked.
That where? On which?
And it's in the footnote there. In the Orthodox.
Which footnote?
19. It says, however, an order of the Persian king was irrevocable. Such an order, however, is suspended with a new decree.
Right, that's why they sent out the second. Yeah. Okay, so verse 19. Mordecai wrote these things in a book and sent it to all the Jews in the kingdom of Xerxes, to those both near and far, to establish these days as holidays and to observe both the 14th and 15th day of Adar. For on these days the Jews had rest from their enemies. Thus Adar is the month which was turned from mourning into joy, from grief into a holiday, to celebrate the whole time with feasting and gladness, sending parcels to friends and to the poor. Okay. Said book is the book we're reading. Right? That tells the story. Verse 22, the Jews accepted everything just as Mordecai wrote to them. How Haman the son of Hammedatha the Macedonian warred against them. How he made a decree and cast lots to exterminate them. How he had gone to the king telling him to hang Mordecai. And how all the evils he plotted against the Jews came upon himself. And how he was hanged, he and his children. Therefore these days were called Purim on account of the lots. Because in their language they are called Pur. Because of the words of this letter, and because of all they had suffered on account of these things, and all that had happened to them. Mordecai established it, and the Jews took it upon themselves, their descendants, and upon those joining with them, not to do otherwise. And these days are to be a memorial throughout every generation, and city and family and province. Thus these days of Purim shall be observed forever, and their remembrance shall not cease in any generation. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote down the many things they had done and the truthfulness of the command of Purim. And Mordecai and Queen Esther established it for themselves, establishing it at that time according to their soundness of mind and their purpose. Esther established it by a command forever, and it was written for a memorial. Chapter 10, and the king levied tribute upon his kingdom both by land and sea, and his power and valor, the riches and the glory of his kingdom. Behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Persia and Media for a memorial. Where does that sound familiar from? Remember first, second, third, fourth kingdoms, right? You want to know more about Xerxes, go read this. Go read some history books. Go read Persian Fire by Tom Holland. Go read a history book. And Mordecai was next to King Xerxes, and he was great in the kingdom and honored by the Jews. And being beloved, he set forth in detail the way of life to all his people. Now there's a little epilogue here. It's only in the Greek. And Mordecai said, these things were from my God, for I recall the dream which I had concerning these things, and not one detail of them has failed. There was a small spring that became a river, there was light in the sun and much water. The river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. The two serpents are Haman and I. The nations of the Gentiles gathering together to destroy the name of the Jews. And my nation which cried out to God and was delivered is Israel. For the Lord has saved his people, and the Lord has rescued us from all these evils. And God performed signs and great wonders which have not happened among the Gentiles. On account of this he made two lots, one for the people of God and one for the Gentiles. And these two lots came in the hour and in the time and in the day of judgment before God and among all the Gentiles. And God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance. And they shall observe these days in the month of Adar, the 14th and 15th day of that month. They shall gather together with joy and gladness before God throughout all generations, forever among his people. And now here's the epilogue to the epilogue, where the Greek version came from. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Okay? Yeah. So now we're in about 50 BC. Dositheus, who said he was a priest and a Levite, and Ptolemy his son, brought in the letter of Purim, which they declared existed, and that Lysimachus, the son of Ptolemy, who was in Jerusalem, had translated it. So that's where the Greek version came from. That was at Alexandria that we have translated here, was from this priest who brought it from where it had been translated into Greek. Okay. So, sort of a final comment on Esther. Even though in the long version God is mentioned, you notice even in the fullest version God is acting very subtly. Right? In the shorter version, God is not explicitly mentioned at all. What's the point of that? Why would you have a book in the Bible that barely mentions God? Well, the point is, we tend to think, especially us as 21st century Americans, we tend to think in a very materialistic kind of way, right? So if somebody comes to us and says, a miracle happened, right, and they describe what happened to us, we usually respond with skepticism, right? We try to think, well, how can we explain said miracle so it's not really a miracle? Right? And we say, well, it couldn't have just been this. Couldn't just this have happened? Couldn't that have happened? And then once we go through all those, if we just totally cannot explain it, then we might accept, well, yeah, I guess that was probably pretty miraculous then. Right? So we have this idea that sort of the world's just chugging along, and every once in a while, very rarely, God comes and does something. And when he does, there's big trumpets and lightning and fire, It's spectacular. Right? But as we've talked about before, especially in the story with St. Elias, when God came to him as not in the fire and not in the earthquake, but in the still small voice. Right? The reality is, God is involved continuously with his creation. Continuously with his creation. The reason the sun's going to come up tomorrow, or we'll put it in 21st century terms. The reason the earth doesn't spin out of orbit and slam into the sun, okay, and kill us all. The reason the moon doesn't come crashing into the earth, the reason we haven't been hit by an asteroid, is because of God. It's God being active in his creation. The reason you and I wake up every morning, haven't died during the night, and get up and continue taking breaths and moving around and living through each day, is because God is giving us life. Okay? So the truth is, pretty much everything is miraculous. We're just so used to it, we aren't thankful for it anymore. Right? Everything we encounter every day comes from God. Every person, everything we have to deal with, it all comes from God. We just don't see him in it. Because we're waiting for something spectacular. Right? We're waiting for something that has to be unusual and out of the ordinary. For us to notice it and be thankful for it. Okay? So, what makes this story special with the minimal mention of God is you look at what God brings about in this story. Salvation of a whole race of people. Right? The vindication of Mordecai, this poor guy who didn't do anything wrong, right? Who's getting ready to be hung just because he offended this pagan official. Right? All this that he brings about. Right? And he never has to put in an appearance. No lightning bolts have to come out of heaven. Right? No huge, miraculous anything. But he brings it about.
By softening one man's
He brings it about. And so it's showing us as we read this book and we see, oh, look how God did that. Right? As Mordecai says to Esther, maybe this is the reason why God had you put in this situation in the first place. It teaches us something about how to look at our lives. How to look at the situations that arise in our lives. Maybe God put me here today with this person in this room for a reason. You know? Look at all these gifts God's given me every day. Looking back on my life. Look at everything God has done for me and where he's brought me. From one point to another. Very subtly. Without putting in a big glorious appearance with angels and trumpets. But look at what he's done. I think that's why this particular book and the way it's written is very important. In addition to all the little themes we picked up. And I think that's probably the most important thing about Esther, is that God accomplishes amazing things all the time. Right? But again, there's not going to be trumpets and a flashing neon sign to tell us. We have to be looking for it. And we have to be ready to give him credit and acknowledgement and thankfulness for it. So that's Esther. That's it for this evening. Now, I don't know, what do people have going on next week? It's 2 days before Christmas, so are people going to be busy? And
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
If people are going to be busy and stuff, we can wait. We can skip next week and wait till the 30th. Is that okay? So next time we get together, we'll be on the evening of the 30th, and we're going to be starting First Maccabees. So I'm going to be handing out Bibles again. But it would have been perfect if we could have gotten First Maccabees in time for Hanukkah.
That's right.
But we didn't quite do it, but we're close. We're close. In First Maccabees, we're going to learn where Hanukkah comes from, amongst other things.
If you waited to spring, you could have celebrated Purim and had another question.
Yeah. Who put the books of the Bible in this order? I.
It's not in our Bible.
Yeah, we're going to be handing out Bibles. For First and Second Maccabees. So that's what's coming up next. We're going to move forward in time a little. It's going to be the Greeks now. We're going to be causing us trouble. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.